All right. Hello, everyone. This is Keith Comito, president of Lifespan.io, and I hope this moment finds you safe and healthy. I'm here today with a truly excellent panel of experts in the field of aging research and related advocacy to have a conversation about the current situation we're all dealing with COVID-19, how it relates to aging, and what this strange moment in time might mean for the future of healthcare. I'm sure this is a conversation many of you are having at home with your friends and colleagues, so why not have it together? Joining us are many faces you might recognize. Dr. David Sinclair of Harvard Medical School, well known for his work involving the red wine molecule resveratrol, the sirtuin class of proteins, and most recently the niacin derivative NMN, which we actually helped crowdfund, and author of the best-selling book, Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. Welcome, David. Dr. Aubrey de Grey, Chief Science Officer and co-founder of the SENS Research Foundation, one of the pillar organizations in our field, driving work to address the root causes of aging directly, and author of the book Ending Aging, which was actually my introduction in this field way back in 2008. Welcome, Aubrey.
Thanks very much for having me.
Tina Woods, founder and CEO of Collider Health, a health-focused innovation catalyst working with organizations, both public and private, as well as CEO and co-founder of Longevity International, which runs the UK all-party parliamentary group for longevity. Welcome, Tina. Dr. Felipe Sierra, the very recently former Director of Aging Biology in the National Institute on Aging in the NIH, having just stepped down, I believe, a few days ago after 17 years. And who's also the founder and coordinator of the Trans NIH Geroscience Interest Group. Welcome, Felipe. And Dr. Daria Khaltourina, founding board member of the International Longevity Alliance, chair of the board of the Russian NGO Council for Public Health and Democracy, and co-chair of the Russian Anti-Tobacco Coalition and Coalition for Alcohol Control, who also co-authored a proposal submitted to the WHO, which helped lead to the inclusion of the aging-related code XT90 in the International Classification of Diseases, which you might remember was a big moment for our field. Welcome, Daria. So, welcome everyone. Before we dive into the thick of it, I think it would be nice to hear simply how each of you are holding up through all this, or one way in which your life or work have been changed. So, Aubrey, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I guess I have got lucky, as so often. I live in a secluded area up in the mountains to the south of Silicon Valley. So social distancing is kind of the default. And it's a gorgeous place to be. And my fiance is here with me, so I don't have that problem either. And I am basically doing some kind of Zoom call about every hour, as far as I can tell. So I'm keeping pretty busy as well. So yeah, life is actually not so bad right here.
Nice. Sounds like it could be worse. Hopefully we're not adding to the Zoom call burden too much. Daria, how about you?
Yeah, I'm fine in self-isolation for like maybe 6 weeks already. The boss in my institute is sick, so she had major problems, and like a lot of people in Ministry of Health or in my institute got sick, and here, you're here, but I'm not affected yet. Hope not to be.
Yes, I'm sure we hope that as well. Hope everyone stays safe. David?
Hey, Keith. Yeah, thanks for organizing this. Well, yeah, my lab was wound down, so it's on maintenance mode, which is frustrating, but it could be worse. I still have a job at least. I've morphed from being a guy that's on a plane half the time to a stay-at-home dad, which has been fantastic in some regards. What I've been doing to be more useful to the planet is, so as you know, I'm entrepreneurial, as some people on this call too. And so one of the companies that I co-founded makes tests for viruses. So that's been exciting and rewarding to see that go ahead. And also the molecule you mentioned, these NAD boosters, they're, at least in compassionate use, have shown surprising effects. So there's a larger scale placebo-controlled trial that's about to begin. And so that's been keeping me busy too.
Great. Something to look forward to, the results there. Felipe.
Yeah, I've also been lucky in terms of health, no problems myself or anybody really close to me. has been a mess in terms of, as Keith mentioned, I did retire from the federal government on Thursday last week, and I was rehired on Friday to run a potential common fund project for the government as well. And I'm trying to figure out how to move to France, where I will start my new job in July. You can imagine that all of that has been a nightmare because of the regulations. Just trying to get a visa for France. Then they sent my passport on FedEx without a plastic container, and it was a rainstorm. You can imagine how my passport looks. So, but other than that, I'm lucky enough not to be directly affected by the virus itself.
Well, I'm sorry about the passport, and congratulations on your very short-lived retirement.
Yeah.
How about you?
I was trying to unmute myself. Yeah, I mean, like a lot of the sentiments here, I'm very fortunate that I haven't directly been affected, including my close family. I think there have been a few silver linings, in a sense, in sort of having a lot more time to reflect on things, do new things. And funnily enough, I seem to be more in touch with my friends and family than I ever was before, just with the endless Zoom calls that we seem to be having. Getting quite literate on the digital front with Zoom meetings, which is quite fun. And actually, with my sort of, in terms of my work, obviously, I do so much work, in this online environment anyway, so it hasn't really made a huge amount of difference. And really what I've been focusing on more than anything is trying to learn from this crisis, not waste a crisis, in terms of my parliamentary work. For those of you who don't know, I essentially run this all-party parliamentary group, which is a cross-sector group, which is really a change machine more than anything. We're really trying to kind of really change how we see health. And we just published a strategy called Health of the Nation. And what we're doing now is to learn as we're learning live the lessons of COVID and what already is kind of what we expected to happen. It's really showing up, the fracture lines, which we're trying to address with the strategy. So we've just been running, have just started a series of roundtable meetings looking at the role of business and actually addressing some of the acute needs coming out of the crisis. So it's been, fast and furious. I mean, very busy period. And fortunately, my friends and family have not suffered too much from it.
Gotcha. Yeah, personally, I'm very much in the same boat as you, in the spirit of trying to not waste the crisis. And since the work that we do on Lifespan.io has always been essentially online, I think our workload has increased. I'm thankful that my family and friends, thankfully no one in my immediate circle has contracted the virus that I know of. And it's been nice for me personally in that I've kind of fled New York City and went to my parents' house where I am here in Long Island. So we've, been playing cards, and, it's always good to spend that time. So that itself has been a joy. So with that, I'd like to begin the discussion, the open questions in earnest. And I'd like to start with something I noticed with the press right when this pandemic started. I noticed that many outlets were covering the fact that COVID-19 has a much higher mortality rate for the elderly and less so for the young, but very often framing it like it was a mystery of sorts, despite the fact that this same curve is true for many diseases, both infectious and non-infectious. So I kind of assumed the fact that aging is a primary risk factor for many diseases was generally understood, but maybe all too often ignored. But now I'm actually not sure. Maybe that's not true. So in either case, what opportunities do we all think that this growing awareness of aging as risk factor presents to catalyze a greater focus on research aimed at addressing the root causes of aging? So open to the floor.
Well, I think the big thing about COVID in relation to the extraordinary risk to the elderly is that it is bigger than your typical infection. We definitely see that the elderly are more vulnerable to seasonal flus and such like, and this is partly because of the inherent lowered ability to fight off infections, and also, of course, let's not forget the lower efficacy of vaccines in the elderly. But the magnitude of that disparity between the elderly and the rest of the population is bigger in the case of COVID, and it's worth emphasizing that. So maybe it's not such a mystery. But of course, it's very important to continue to do more work on understanding why this is true. And I certainly hope that we can leverage this fact to get people to focus more on the vital importance of research to restore the immune systems of the elderly to something like they were at a younger age.
Gotcha.
I would add that I think it's important that we capitalize on this newfound thing, because as Keith says, it's surprising that people don't realize that this is more exacerbated, as Aubrey says, but nevertheless it's something expected for us and not for the rest of the public. And that's something that we have to take advantage of, to use this opportunity as a teaching moment where we can emphasize not only that there is that disparity, but also what we all aim to do, which is we have ways of addressing that issue, and we should work more on that sense. So it is an opportunity that we need to take advantage of.
Felipe, on that subject, from your perspective working in the NIH, as I understand it, the federal budget has, historically kind of prioritized disease-specific funding as opposed to the root causes, behind many diseases. And obviously, I think there's been a frustration in the field generally that, this is sort of illogical, but it's kind of calcified in that way. But this moment also is showing how changes can happen. There's a lot of budget reallocations to try to help with COVID, so change is possible. Specifically, do you think there's any sort of kind of policy lever or type of legislation or something we should be trying to push for right now in this moment?
Well, there is, of course, more funds allocated by the federal government to fight this specific disease. I think we need to emphasize that money, for example, was given to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Because it's an infectious disease, it kind of makes sense. However, it does affect the elderly more so. So I think it's an opportunity again to emphasize studies that are being done, where we are taking the approach of being more in the defensive side of the strategy. Basically, if you're gonna play a game or go to war, whatever, you need to have an offensive aspect, which is attack the virus, develop a vaccine. All of those things are absolutely necessary because they are offensive against this virus. But we also have to have a defensive strategy, improve the health of the most vulnerable populations. And that has the advantage, of course, as we all know, but we need to make this clear to the rest of the public and the policymakers. This defensive attitude, the geroscience approach to the problem, is useful not only for this virus, but it will be useful for the next virus and the following and the following. And that's what we have to emphasize. So we are ready. Every virus that we get, and we're getting them more and more because of the ease of travel and all of that, each one will require the development of a vaccine, but each time the vaccine takes a year or so. We have to have an approach that we can deploy right away. And the only approach that I can think is useful is what we are all working on.
Yeah, I think we can all agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, I didn't expect anybody to disagree with that one.
Keith, I just wanted to, from the kind of the industry side, and I think Tina can speak to this as well, working with the UK government here, what we've seen kind of happen is kind of twofold. Is one, what we're talking about is basically people, it's much easier for me and it's much easier for Tina and probably each of you to kind of walk into a conversation now and say kind of, you reference, the great effect that's happened on older people and people with with morbidities. You reference that and say, hey, that's actually what we were intending, what we were talking to you about last week. That was this, this is this problem, right? The other thing more on the industry side is we're seeing that like direct to consumer, testing, things like this is just now it's just flying out where, the FDA might have had questions before, or the NHS wasn't you know, you have to come into a central hospital to do every single thing kind of thing. That's actually changing like rapidly. And so that's in our world, that's kind of like the rails as which we can build a lot of stuff on. And so seeing that is actually happening quite quickly and quite positive. So to be optimistic, we're seeing two kind of big changes.
Yep, gotcha. And by the way, if you were curious, that was Michael, one of our heroes, which is why he was able to participate. I think we're going to circle back on that later in the call, where we'll take some more questions and input, Michael. But on that subject, I think it would be good to maybe bring in Tina and or Daria here on sort of the international perspectives here. You know, maybe are you guys having more success in marrying this message of aging as preventative in a governmental sense?
So I think governments everywhere are right now kind of shocked on what's happening, and they will realize it later. It is very important for us, indeed, first of all, to advocate for aging to be the major risk factors, and also use the opportunities of grants and encourage researchers which are into the longevity field or aging field to apply as many grants as possible, because indeed aging is a risk factor, and it's different, for example, from flu or for other respiratory diseases where you have also kids. But no, here kids suffer much less than from the flu. So it's important also to work with research community and to try to guide them not to be caught into this pandemic sort of mood, but also still work on aging within this framework.
So just to add to that, I mean, I think, you know, the figures, certainly in the UK, it's a massive wake-up call. I think people are pretty bloody shocked, you know, what's going on. We've got the worst, you know, the highest deaths in Europe. I think we're seeing that the poor are twice as likely to die than the others. Obviously, we've got shocking statistics about what's happening in the care homes. And now, even today in today's press, that, you know, latest data showing that obesity doubles, you know, the risk of hospitalization. So I think, you know, going to this moment, I mean, I think, you know, we do want to capture this moment, however horrific it is, as a real wake-up call to how we really need to address, you know, health prevention, you know, prevent people from you know, getting obese and all these sort of lifestyle-driven diseases, which are putting people at greater risk. And clearly the health inequalities and income inequalities has been absolutely sort of thrust into the spotlight, certainly in the US as well. So I think that's a global sort of wake-up call that health inequalities is very much linked to wealth, income inequalities. I think, you know, the good thing about an epidemic is that things can change very drastically. I mean, who would have thought 8 weeks ago that the British government would do the bailout that it did for business? I mean, we effectively have had in place a basic universal income. I mean, they're going to be lifting that. I think they also realize that we're heading into the deepest recession on record. So of course, that's going to focus the minds. But I think, you know, at moments like this, we want to seize that moment when the time is right. And I think if nothing else, coming out of this crisis, at the very least, look at what we've done what we've had to sacrifice as a nation to protect our health. I mean, the drastic measures. So if nothing else, let's please treasure and respect our health, you know, when we come out of this. So what do we need to do? So we need to obviously take more action ourselves individually, but, you know, it's all stakeholders. We have to, you know, we have to take that step. So I think, you know, so I think what we do need to do is absolutely engage the public. We absolutely need to highlight all of our respective responsibilities, and we're all in this together. So I think, and what I'm hoping will emerge from this is effectively, you know, what is this new normal? What is this new social contract going to look like for society? Because I can tell you, capitalism ain't working so well when you look at what's happening. So I think there's going to be some really, really bigger questions sort of coming out of this, which are going to be, you know, pretty profound, pretty fundamental. And of course, that goes into a whole bunch of other discussions that we're having around, you know, the role of the public in becoming more informed about the science and technology. Because if there is one silver lining out of this, you know, is the humongous scientific collaboration that is taking place. We don't want to stop that. And it's also highlighting a lot of the issues around data infrastructure and data sharing. So if you're in the science and tech space, and all of us here, we're immersed in this field of aging research, biomarkers, and all the rest of it, let's capture this moment and really drive forward some very different new thinking in equality, you know, for all, and making sure that the benefits of science do reach everyone. Sorry, I can go on forever, so I'll stop there.
I think that's a very important point of how this moment in time allows us to create, in a sense, a broader solidarity with other, socioeconomic kind of thrusts. On the point of sort of social engagement broadly, David, I know that you've been posting a lot lately about COVID and how Jared be able to provide protection here. How has the kind of response been to that dialogue? Do you find that people are kind of receptive to seeing the connections here?
Most people are. Early on in the pandemic, when people were really scared a couple of months ago, to talk about aging research, people just, subset of people were negative about it. Now that people are calming down and thinking more about it and realizing that they're probably all not going to die, they're much more open to it. Now, there are a few things that have happened. One is that the general public globally is more interested in hearing what scientists have to say than ever before, which is not just specific to our field. People are, when I say people, I'm generalizing way too much, but you know what I mean. A lot of people are more interested in their health than ever before. The idea that in your 40s and certainly 50s and 60s, that you could potentially die is a new thing to most people. And so that's made them look in the mirror. There's a reason why all the gym equipment across the planet is now sold out. And I think that's going to continue, and we can capitalize on that. And I think we can all appreciate that trying to convince people that aging is different, or is not so different than chronic disease, and is a main driver of that. It's been a challenge because it's just weird for most people to think that cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's are actually driven by aging, even though it's really obvious to us. But now that you introduce an infectious disease into the mix, it seems to be easier for people to grasp the concept that being old makes you more susceptible to dying within a week or two. And I think using that as an example of why aging research is important is a huge opportunity for us as a field. Just because psychologically, it seems that people are more open to this idea. And it's not just the chronic diseases that make people susceptible to COVID-19. There's obviously other things going on that make the disease progress more rapidly, even before their diseases play a role in their final demise.
Right, that definitely makes sense. And that ties into sort of the next question that I want to ask, which is, on that subject, one obvious connection point between just aging research writ large and this COVID-19 situation is one of the key reasons why we decline with age is the decreasing effectiveness of our immune system, or immunosenescence. And given that, much of the promising research in our field is aimed at addressing immunosenescence, for example, Greg Fay's recent study involving regeneration of the thymus, to put a very fine point on what you were just saying there, David, is there actually a legitimate argument to be made that pandemics such as this would not nearly be such a overall socioeconomic concern if everyone had young immune systems? Would R naught be decreased in a population of people with young, healthy immune systems, et cetera?
Well, of course. And I hope that more of us talk and write about that. Andrew Scott, an economist in London, has written some of this. It was a great piece. You should look it up. He did some calculations that if we had a younger population like we did in 1918, the pandemic would be half as long, and the burden on society economically would be, I forget what the number is, but dramatically less. That kind of rationale makes a lot of sense to me. And in fact, imagine if no or very few people were so frail. I would say that this could be just like a regular flu season, and we could have gotten on with our lives. Now, you can say that, but I think what we need to do more as scientists and people who touch the public is to actually have those numbers on hand when people want to know what the facts are.
Right. Yeah. One paper I think of there is, a paper that we've talked about a lot before, which was, I believe, the 2013 paper by Goldman and Oleshansky, et cetera, that was sort of making a value proposition of, glibly, it was something like, if we delay the onset of age-related diseases by 20%, it would save $142 billion per year economically in, I believe, the American healthcare system, with some caveats and tweaks. But, I mean, maybe Aubrey, you know this, now that I'm thinking about it, in light of what David was just saying, I don't think there was like any calculation in that formula for the potential economic effects of mitigating epidemics. So I think maybe there's a rewrite of that paper that is due to make that value proposition.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a rewrite due for a bunch of reasons, actually. So that paper that you refer to was a kind of sequel to an initiative that was taken forward by a few very prominent, very credentialed people, Rich Miller, Daniel Perry, Jay Olshansky, and Bob Butler, the original head of the National Institute on Aging, which was called the Longevity Dividend. Now that made basically the same argument. It was an economic argument that even if we were to postpone the health problems of late life by a small number of years, I think they worked on the basis of 7 years, then the economic benefits to the US or to the world would be just, just like unimaginable numbers. And the impact on public policy was pretty much exactly zero. So you have to ask why. Politicians care about money because they know that the public cared about money and they want to get re-elected. So you would kind of have thought that that would have been effective. And to my mind, the only really good explanation for why it was not affected was that the audience just didn't believe that anything could actually be done. That in other words, they thought, yes, if we throw $1 billion or $3 at the problem, then people's research will go better. But this is aging, isn't it? It's immutable, and therefore it won't actually have the effect. And therefore, the fact that if we had the effect, then we'd save all this money is irrelevant. So now, we may be in a better position simply because there has been more progress in all of our laboratories around the world. We have got much more credibility around the idea that the health problems of late life, not just the so-called diseases of late life, can be postponed substantially with foreseeable medical advances. I think that really is where it comes down to. And absolutely, I agree that we must leverage the pandemic in this regard and shine a particularly bright light on that big component of age-related decline, which we're talking about, namely age-related decline of the immune system. But really, it's in order to use the immune system as an exemplar of the whole of aging and the economic benefits that can accrue from throwing just a small amount of money at this. You mentioned Greg Fay's study. Of course, it's not the only one that has shown quite substantial progress towards rejuvenating the immune system. And if the attention of policymakers can be really heavily drawn to the fact that progress is being made already, and therefore it is very likely that improved funding would accelerate that progress rather than just being money down the drain, then we've got a chance.
That makes sense to me. So let's say that we do that. Say another paper comes out and it really makes a clear value proposition here. I guess question to Daria, Tina, and Felipe: what is needed sort of behind that? How can we leverage such information to actually affect, governmental change here?
Yeah, so I completely agree with what everybody had said. Maybe the issue with that original proposal, the longevity dividend, was the same problem that we had in the field with the proposal many years ago to develop biomarkers of aging. It was too premature. The people did not buy it, as Aubrey says. And just like what happens with biomarkers, where now we all agree that they are absolutely necessary, when the NIA initially proposed biomarkers, it was labeled a disaster. Okay, and so there's a time for things, and I think the time is ripe now for indeed revisiting that paper by Goldman, which, by the way, Keith, it was not 20 years, it was 2 years. What they analyzed, that 2 years of extension of the health span period that will produce trillions of dollars in savings. So the arguments are there, and as Aubrey says, now we do have it's not just pie in the sky. In fact, I have a slide where I have it pie in the sky to explain that. No, it's not. Right? It is the time to take advantage, and indeed, taking advantage of this opportunity. I think Daria mentioned that the need for all of our researchers to apply for funds related to COVID, because we can show that it works on something that the public really cares. And indeed, we're seeing, well, at the NIH until last week, I was seeing that there was a large increase in applications. Even though we don't have extra money, people want to do something about it. So I think it's a golden opportunity that we have to take. But as you said, the paper by Goldman, I think, needs to be revisited and updated and brought back into public discussion.
If I could just make, I guess, an observation and a comment, just generally in terms of some of the work that I've been doing. I mean, I think, we have to remember, any sort of status, any sort of established institutions, they're very resistant to change. The status quo is always preferable. And a lot of, what we're trying to do, and I know a lot of people on this call, I mean, we're evangelists. We're trying to get people to think about things differently. And that's always extremely hard work. And I think really more than anything, it's about, it's about engaging hearts and minds. And politicians and academia, they all like their evidence. But I think what we have to do is literally, and this is a lot of what I do and spend my time doing, is literally getting heads together in a room, different perspectives, and slowly but surely, once you have enough conversations and with enough, knowledge, around the table, things do start to shift. But it's very, very hard work. And I think this is where, it's education, it's advocacy, it's that slow burn, it's constant. And I think all of us, and I think the way to ignite that, of course, is to get the general public on side. And that's really the trick of all this. And I know that's obviously very much what LEAF is trying to do, because it's the general public. Politicians want to be elected, so they're going to listen. So if there's enough of a movement from the general public calling for something, then they will listen. So, and it's like all things, all institutions have their own reasons for existing, which often are very perversely aligned to the broader needs of the citizens. I mean, that goes for the business community, and I won't call out, obvious industry sectors who do not want the status quo to change. But in the end, we have to look at, what are the burning platforms that's really going to drive this change that we need to see, which is all around, health and all these things that we're discussing now. But change is hard.
Yep, I definitely agree with, obviously, the social movement behind some sort of legislative change to make politicians listen to it. But Daria, I actually think your perspective could be interesting here, because as I understand it, you had great success in the sense like anti-tobacco legislation, etc. So are there any lessons learned from your experiences there of how exactly we can go through this process?
Yes, perhaps one suggestion is to build a really good discourse, is to first write a paper which will establish this discourse. I think that Felipe and Aubrey already did steps in this direction, like publishing papers, presentations. We should publish more papers, or one really good paper which explains exactly why, what mechanisms of aging make people vulnerable to COVID-19 too. And more and more researchers will face this paper from different layers, from just researchers to high-level researchers with connections with government, I mean. So it's important to write more papers and publish them. And second, what we could do is to contact with the teams which are involved in developing new treatments, and to propose them possible anti-aging treatments. For example, we have David here, and there is research that vitamin B close compounds could be saving mice from experimentally induced acute respiratory distress syndrome. So I'm sure that nicotinamide riboside may be saving people here. So we need to propose this treatment. Like, for example, our colleagues and friends did in China. They proposed this stem cell clinical trials. So we should be proposing clinical trials. I think it's time.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I don't know how useful it will be, but one thing that I was thinking about is, you see sometimes petitions that can gather steam on change.org or something like that. So I think if there ever becomes any sort of draft legislation that the community can sort of rally behind, that's certainly something that Leaf would like to help with. We actually have a tool on our site that we've never used yet that's sort of like change.org that would prominently feature the signatures of researchers and MDs, et cetera. So maybe that will be useful at some point. But I actually want to stick on that topic of sort of reversing lung damage. One of the patterns that we've noticed in our outreach efforts generally at Leaf, and corroborated by polls from the Pew Research Center and YouGov, et cetera, is that generally people are more comfortable with the idea of repair rather than augmentation, fixing a broken arm versus an abnormally strengthened arm, et cetera. So given that COVID-19 is projected to eventually infect a large percentage of the population, and that many who recover from even moderate cases may have permanently affected lung capacity due to scarring and fibrosis, does this create some sort of meaningful way to center biorejuvenation research? Like, we're all damaged. We need to fund research to repair that damage, which, by the way, may have a positive lifespan effect. Have any thoughts about that sort of like messaging?
Yeah, I think that's is certainly one possibility, but the rejuvenation field still needs a lot more work to be accepted, precisely as you say, because we're more familiar with this repair. And yet everybody understands that repairing something that's broken is much, much more difficult than preventing it from being broken. So I think a preventative approach is what we should be focusing on. Preventative before things happen. The regenerative is very, very useful, but it's still more in early stages. So it's more difficult to sell it to a population. I mean, it's easy for us to understand it because we see the data and we see glimmers of hope. But I think that prevention is what we really need to focus on.
Yeah, I think we should probably try to separate the questions that exist and the mistakes and uncertainties that exist in the public mind on this question. Certainly, prevention sounds like it's easier than repair, though sometimes it isn't. And of course, my work has centered on the idea that maybe sometimes repair is easier, but repair is also easier to sell as being desirable. Preventative medicine in general, whether for late onset conditions or for early onset conditions, has always been a hard sell to the public, because the public kind of know that medicine in general is sort of black magic, and that especially new experimental medicines may do more harm than good. So if you're not yet sick, then maybe the cost-benefit ratio is perceived to be not very good. And of course, we do have exceptions like statins, for example, or ACE inhibitors, but very few exceptions. And the ones we do have that are big and successful, they kind of got there by the back door, being initially used later on in such progressive conditions. So I feel that, we could actually have a chance of leveraging the pandemic and the changed, attitudes to health that exist as a way to get people to think more positively about repair as both feasible and desirable, though without in any way denying what Felipe says, that prevention is, we really want to go in the sweet spot between the two. We want to rejuvenate people, yes, but we want to start doing so early on. However, the other thing that I think we need to focus on here is that at the moment, people are more interested in repair when they feel that the repair can be comprehensive. So young people, are much more interested in repairing themselves than old people are, because old people kind of are more fatalistic, shall we say, about the fact that the repair will only be cosmetic or at least very far from comprehensive. And maybe we can get beyond that now. Maybe we can get people to see the whole thing as more of a continuum, that repair can be more comprehensive than the public have historically thought it could be. And maybe we can get somewhere with that.
No, I agree with that. I would like to circle back on something I believe Tina had mentioned when she mentioned data infrastructure. I mean, one of the results of this pandemic is that I think it's shown a light on how maybe we don't have the, medical data infrastructure that can enable rapid responses to situations like this. And obviously, increased capability of data collection is one way to solve this. But as is kind of happening now in the public discourse, it can prompt, tensions over privacy and surveillance. But Tina and Daria, I think you both have experience with technologies which can potentially create smart ways for open data sharing, AI, blockchain, etc. Is COVID creating an opportunity here for such initiatives to move forward that hopefully maybe one day could include a place for like aging biomarkers, etc. as well, instead of just COVID status or whatever?
You're going to have to ask that one again, Keith, because we lost Daria for a moment.
Oh, okay. Basically, I'll sum it up really quick. Does this moment in time create opportunities to use AI and blockchain for open data sharing to, hopefully track information that could help us, not just COVID, but maybe biomarkers of aging as well?
Daria, do you want to comment first and I come later, or should I comment first?
Yeah, I guess, go first. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think I think the whole COVID crisis has certainly shown up the inadequacies, and and this whole kind of debate between sort of citizen empowerment, surveillance state, and all the rest of it. I mean, but we're seeing already in the UK, we are going down this route of obviously with our contact tracing app and all the rest of it, going down this very centralized route, to essentially get that into implementation very, very quickly. And of course, that has been the success story of the Asian countries in South Korea, Singapore, etc., who've done incredibly well instituting effectively a tool which is about monitoring you, but actually people will put up with that if it's actually going to delay their quarantine period. So there's this whole question mark about, well, what are we giving up and what are we getting back? It's the whole, it's the classic question. But I think as far as the sort of the route, sort of open data and sort of whether we go down sort of centralized versus federated sort of decentralized routes, I think again the timing is really, really bang on right to actually really look at this. Because there's this tendency, and certainly we're seeing that now with the NHS, they want to control and centralize everything. But actually, what we're seeing is there are sort of limitations to that, and of course, there's a lot of sort of citizen concerns over over that, etc. But one of the things that we're looking at in the work that we're doing at an all-party parliamentary level, we've got one of our recommendations in our Health of the Nation was to start this conversation around what we've called this open life data framework. And what that's about is to look at moving beyond this sort of this obsession with just sort of the data sets in what I call the sick space. We had a lot of media hysteria about all the sort of the asset that the NHS has, which of course it is, but of course it's all these other assets, and that's going to drive, for example, all the research in aging, aging biomarker research. So we're trying to open up and start that conversation so that people can start to understand what this is all about and what's at stake if we go down certain routes. And already, we've got this timing now with the epidemic to really shine a spotlight as to what are those data models that we should be looking at, taking the best of what China's, doing in terms of, galloping ahead with their AI sort of strategy and obviously social credit and all the rest of it, looking at what big tech are doing in the US, and then looking at other models, that are being pioneered also in the European scene. And again, looking at these questions of, sort of decentralized versus centralized, citizen empowerment versus state surveillance, looking at all of these things to come up with, models that actually will appeal to, I guess, a more westernized view, certainly if you're living in the UK, but will, essentially open up the data sharing that we obviously need to drive ethical aging research, to drive all this research, which has been at the heart of why we're seeing the innovation that we're seeing at the moment is through that collaboration data sharing. So I think it's opening up a lot of questions. I think the epidemic will allow us to have those conversations at a moment in time when people are ready to listen. So I think let's really take this opportunity. And I know I've been speaking to Michael about this. So I think it's very exciting to have those conversations, looking at data as a public good. All these conversations I think need to be had, and the general public need to understand this and what's at stake when we go too far down a certain route. So anyway, I can go on forever, but I think it's a really interesting time to ask these questions.
Gotcha. Daria, maybe you can follow up on the blockchain side of how this might help allay some of the fears.
I think we need to speak of something simpler about indeed data sharing. There is a lot of data collected in different countries, including biomarkers on people with this COVID-19. And if it would be collected together, we would have a really nice database, and we could really make research and see like why these people progress and how it is related to aging. But unfortunately, in some places, governments and some countries, even like hospitals, they just keep it by themselves. And it would be really important to start advocating for this data sharing platforms on this issue. And the WHO made a protocol on how data should be collected from these people. And it includes a nice set of biomarkers. Even this set of maybe 10 biomarkers could also already work as a biomarkers of aging, because it is aging-related disease. No wonder biomarkers are biomarkers of aging and pathology too. So we really need to try to talk to our governments to first to make collections of this data and make it available to researchers without harming the privacy of the patients.
Yeah, on that subject, I believe that there's some countries like Estonia that have started this sort of journey of making medical records, medical records, blockchain standardized. Maybe it would be interesting, Felipe and/or David, given what we see of the current healthcare system in America, do we think that this is a plausible thing that could actually be implemented anytime soon, or is the current system so entrenched that you think it's going to take a while before we do anything like blockchain healthcare records?
David, I'll let you answer.
I was going to say the same thing. I've seen a lot of nervousness. The US in particular, probably any other country, doesn't like the government and doesn't want the government looking into their business. And it's even been a struggle trying to get them to get used to a contact tracing app on their phone. So I think it has to be forced upon them for them to adopt it. And politicians generally don't like forcing things upon their people.
Yep, I think I'm kind of that opinion. I think as blockchain hopefully develops, it will hopefully create ways to get the benefits of sharing while still keeping like your personal data anonymized. And maybe if we can really pin that down, that'll help that situation. But remains to be seen. We're coming up near the end of the first part of our conversation here, which is the open questions. But I want to end it on kind of a positive comment / question. One positive aspect that I've noticed come out of this, admittedly terrible situation is great expressions of solidarity with the elderly. Many voices have been saying that it is not okay to sacrifice the elderly in times such as these, just for the sake of the economy or whatever, and that they should be valued and protected. And I think it can, believably be argued that in general, at least in America, we've not done a great job, up until now of valuing the elderly in society. So what are you seeing out there as far as how this moment could maybe help to change this, and maybe how we could use that to create a bridge between not just, the longevity research community, but, the AARP and other organizations like that, to create sort of a solidarity movement for, taking care physically of the elderly, which also would have benefits for everyone?
Yeah, I think it's really important and really exciting and gives us an enormous opportunity. I think the political classes, the decision makers and policy makers around the world have historically looked at the argument that the elderly are people too, and they have said, really people are selfish. Voters ultimately care about things that benefit them more than they care about things that benefit their parents. And therefore, we kind of don't really buy that argument. And I must say, I have found over the years that, even when talking to potential donors, in other words, philanthropists as opposed to the government, but the same kind of thing applies, that, people are interested in financing this research to the extent that they feel they can benefit personally. And our major donors have typically come from people in their 40s and 50s, and almost none of them from people in their 70s or 80s. So, you kind of think, but because they think they're not the work is not going to be in time for that. So it's like, you know, it kind of maybe that we have an opportunity now to upend that, to overturn that assumption, and to say, well, look, you know, the level of compliance that we're seeing worldwide, but, you know, let's just talk about the US for the moment. Across the country, of course, there are protests and, you know, and some resistance here and there, but by and large, the compliance has been astonishing, despite the fact that the people who are being prevailed upon to change their lives so much are, by and large, people who are not in the high-risk groups. This seems to me to be an argument that should be articulated really emphatically to policymakers as a way to get them to recognize that maybe putting money into helping the future health of the elderly is actually a vote winner.
Obviously, I agree. One line that I saw from a recent Huffington Post article, I believe, was from a 90-year-old woman that, you know, touched me at least. And she said, our lives, our dreams, our productivity don't end when we turn 65, an age that society had decided was old enough. No limit should be set on when a person's life is no longer valuable. And I thought that was a nice sentiment. Tina, I see you were looking to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment and an observation, just, you know, just again, the climate in the UK, and I don't know whether this is transferring across to other countries, but I mean, you know, this whole discussion now as we're sort of facing, you know, coming out of lockdown and how we're going to do it. And there's kind of a huge, I guess, revolt, I guess one can call it, you know, in the press this weekend, you know, with the baby boomers, you know, saying, well, you know, the over 70 shouldn't be the only ones quarantined and where everyone else gets to go out. And I think it introduced a whole bunch of discussion around who decides and why is it that so-called the over 70s all have to be locked into one category. And I think what we saw was, I guess, the more vocal kind of baby boomers that is, you know, shouting out, because they're not like the older generation. They're very, very different. So I think that there's a voice there that can certainly be harnessed. And so I think that's something that's an interesting one. And I think it also introduces this whole concept, because we all talk about biological age versus chronological age, and, you know, all these sorts of things. And I think it really has thrust into the limelight, you know, some of those concepts and what we've all been talking about, obviously in the aging longevity sort of space. But it is all down to, you know, all these sort of factors. What puts people at risk? You know, it's ill health. It's all these other factors. So I think, you know, again, it opens up this whole discussion around what it is that puts people at risk for COVID. What are the decisions that need to be made, you know, in terms of, you know, removing the quarantines, et cetera, and again, it provides an opportunity to really have these discussions about ageism, which of course is a massive problem. Ageism is probably one of the biggest problems that we have. We've got to tackle that. So I think, you know, again, this is a moment, you know, with COVID, which really which enables us to, you know, to hit hard with some of those points that need to be hit hard with.
Absolutely. Any follow-up thoughts on that from anyone?
I wanted to second that the problem of ageism, I think, is something that's critical that we address. And people have said, yes, this provides an opportunity because people do value the health of their parents. Aubrey says that they value more their own, and that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that they don't value the other one. It's just that it comes second. Okay, I will take second. But as Tina says, the current, the baby boomers, of which I am, most of us are, no, some of us, no, just a few of us. Anyway, baby boomers have changed perceptions of the world all along, from when they were teenagers, and they changed the way teenagers are viewed. And all along they have done it. So I have big faith in that they will talk about what has been said, the difference between chronological and physiological age and so on. But as a research community, we have to give parameters by which we can measure that. We don't have currently a way of addressing whether I am chronologically or physiologically older or younger than my chronological age. We just don't have it. So basically, I would say that this points to a fallacy, to a problem that we have to address, and maybe we should make a point of, yes, we wish we have had that. We didn't, but we should have it for the next one.
I agree. David, I think you had your hand raised.
Well, just briefly, because we have other topics probably, but like Aubrey was saying, I've been shocked, pleasantly surprised, put it that way, of how people have defended the elderly. I would never have expected it to be this strong. Tom Moore, the UK veteran who just turned 100, there was an outpouring of love for this guy, and I've never seen people love centenarians like that before. So it's really positive. Humanity is, better than I thought, so that's a good sign. But I don't know how long the goodwill will last. I sent out a tweet to try and get a sense of that last night, which said, will governments send us back home if the pandemic goes, if we have a resurgence, or will they let nature take its course? And I didn't give an opinion, but the feedback was, oh gee, about half of the people said we need to go back in, and then the other half said, at that point, it's survival of the fittest, I'm done with this. And I think as this goes on, if we are forced to go back in, then I don't think people will feel as happy as they are now to just protect the elderly and sacrifice their own careers because of that.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And, obviously there's much discussion there of what's the right way to, protect everyone while still having an economy that functions. And, to circle back on the earlier conversation, I think that's why I think that itself creates an opportunity for, frontlining geroprotective strategies, because if everybody is healthier, there's less of an issue, there's less quarantine that would be necessary. Obviously, a lot of steps before we get there. But at this point, I would like to start to open the floor to take questions from some of our Lifespan heroes who are joining us here on the call. And as a quick reminder, if you're enjoying this discussion and appreciate our work in general at lifespan.io to overcome the diseases of aging, please consider supporting us by becoming a Lifespan hero at lifespan.io/hero. In addition to helping us do what we do, this also allows you to join events like this for free and receive discounts at our larger events, such as our upcoming Ending Age-Related Diseases Conference in August, which this year, as you can imagine, is going online, and hope to see all you there. And you can check that out at lifespan.io/conference. But now onto some questions. Maybe Steve, you can toss the microphone to some of the people on the call who would like to ask a question.
I suppose we better start with explaining on how they can do that. So for those of you who wish to ask a question, got a couple of choices. You can type it in the chat if you're shy, like me, or at the bottom of the bar, or there should be a raise hand icon, which allows you to, raise your hand. It's pretty obvious. So if anybody's got a question, do raise your hand, and then I can unmute you so that you can ask a question. So any questions?
I see there's one pending from Michael. Hopefully I don't butcher your last name, Nuchki. So maybe toss the microphone or read it aloud.
I can do that. Okay, it's a question for Aubrey. You've been saying that we're on the verge of a global sudden awareness of the potential of healthy life extension, and this will lead to great expectations. How do you think this pandemic shapes this idea? And then what do we do when that expectation manifests?
Yeah. So in one sense, this kind of is already answered by a couple of the things that have been said already. First of all, the fact that from an economic perspective, maybe it's time to revisit the messages that were sent out, perhaps prematurely, as Felipe said, around the longevity dividend concept. And secondly, the fact that, notwithstanding the responses to David's tweet, there does seem to be quite a bit of acknowledgement that the elderly do actually matter and that they are entitled to health. However, I think perhaps what Michael is referring to is that I've been saying recently quite aggressively that the danger we are coming up to, and this is something that I've been saying prior to the pandemic, is that the progress that we are all making in the laboratories around the world will fairly soon, like in the next few years, get to the point of sufficient proof of concept, shall we say, of the plausibility of substantially postponing health problems of late life, that people will start thinking this way. People will actually start to believe that they will not just live a little bit longer than their parents did, but rather they may live healthily a lot longer than their parents did. And that makes has a lot of implications for people's spending decisions in terms of what kind of life insurance they want, what kind of health insurance, what kind of pension, and so on. And policymakers and decision makers, both in governments around the world and in the major industries relating to these things, need to be ready for that. I've been calling it anticipating the anticipation. It's just not happening yet, even though I try to give this message as much as possible. And I think maybe we can we can deliver that message even more loudly in the context of the pandemic. But it's really complicated. I think, as we've all been saying for the past 10 minutes or so, the potential is there to have a really decisive and lasting and beneficial influence on policymakers. But we could easily miss the boat, because right now they're not listening to us because they've got their minds focused on the immediate concerns of controlling the pandemic itself. And as soon as they pull out of that, there's going to be an awful lot of people lobbying them to come up with particular new positions on this or that, and we could easily be drowned out. That's the real danger.
Makes sense. Anybody have a follow-up to that before we take more questions?
Yeah, I was just going to add, support that, just to say that, it's great to, we've got this moment now, but of course, coming out of this, the immediate priorities are going to be bailing out the economic collapse, which is obviously going to focus a lot of minds in governments around the world, and and individuals and families, and businesses. So I think that's the real challenge, actually, in getting that sustained kind of momentum going and that long-lasting kind of behavioral change sort of element, to kind of, in this new normal, sort of really, really making sure we just don't go back to the status quo and letting immediate sort of crises, priorities take over, because that's always, very easy for that to happen.
I see on that subject, I see a note in the chat about how the younger generation right now obviously can care about things like climate change and other major risks. So they should technically be able to care about this. And just one note that I was just thinking of while you all were talking was, it's a little bit philosophical or psychological, but Aubrey, you've talked in the past about what you call the pro-aging trance, in the sense that the Stockholm syndrome that we all have with death, because it's been so hopeless for so long. It's like, don't even get my hopes up. I don't even want to think about it. But what's unique right now, and I don't know if it could be leveraged in any way, is that many people, including younger people, are thinking about their mortality and their frailty in a very real way, which maybe creates some opportunities there as well.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the problem, of course, is that younger people, when presented with a risk of death, that arises from an infection, they are generally thinking more or less in the same way that they think about road accidents. In other words, they're thinking about acute problems, things that are likely to kill them at once. And I'm not sure that that's easy to leverage into a better appreciation of the importance of controlling the chronic progressive conditions that they are not yet facing.
I have another perspective on that. The young people that I've been in touch with are more concerned about larger issues than motorcycle accidents. They are concerned about, do I have a future? Do I care about aging for myself? I don't think I will get there. The world as I know it is going to end before I get old. So there's more pressing questions like climate change, which I should care about more than what you care about, which is getting old. And that's something I've heard from many young people. And it's a challenge, because the reason I wanted to bring the subject is because personally, I don't know how to respond to that. And I wonder if you guys have a response that I can give.
If I can add a comment on that, actually. We talked a lot about, again, in the context of the work that I've been doing in the past year or so, how do we ignite attention in the younger groups? Because of course, if we're talking about, because a lot of what we've been talking about is healthy behaviors, you know, a life course approach. So from even before you're born, but of course, as when you're young, we know, for example, childhood obesity is a massive issue that puts you in very bad stead, you know, later in your life. So one of the things that we looked at, and one of the links that we looked at is of course, you know, living greener, living longer is a theme that does resonate with younger audiences. Of course, they are much more concerned about climate change. And of course, we do know that the solutions for healthier, longer lives is actually connected to the climate change agenda, you know, active travel, you know, greener spaces, you know, healthier food, better food, microbiome. You know, we're all connected. And I think that the one big thing that we really should be looking at to really ignite public attention, and that's the one thing that COVID has shown us, is how delicate this ecosystem is of humans, animals, the planet is. And we've you know, cocked it up. I mean, you know, it's and this is really hitting us. So I think that's a message that I think will really resonate with younger people. And of course, and I can see, I've got three you know, older sons. You know, the youngest is 18. You know, they're quite pessimistic, actually, you know, and I think, you know, they need to be engaged in the solutions for the future, which are going to be around, you know, climate change issues, you know, for a lot of them. So I think there's an interesting, you know, connection there, which I think we can, you know, use a lot more of in galvanizing younger people.
I agree with that. That's why, you know, it's a little bit of like a pet, you know, interest of mine, but that's why I like mythology so much, is that I feel like, you know, there's a real way to maybe position what we're working on as a cause here, you know, in the grand spectrum of human development. As in a sense, this is maybe the fruition of the very first hero's journey. That's why I like to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And, you know, people love superhero movies now. You know, I think there's a way to sort of contextualize that this is something grand and exciting. We're at like a pivotal moment potentially in human history. And I think that has its use. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning, basically, is that idea, like, I can do something maybe meaningful. And I think everyone is looking for that. Steve, do we have more questions on the call?
I do, and a slight update on the way to ask questions. It's difficult for me because I don't have a hand to raise because I'm the host. But apparently, Zoom had an update recently, and they very nicely decided to move everything around so no one knows what they're doing. Apparently, the raise hand option now is lurking in the, where was it, participant section. So I hope someone can actually find it. So do pipe up if anybody's got a question, raise your hand.
In the meantime, I see one pending from our Facebook audience, which is, don't you, this is from Ramina Rami, don't you think that certain tissues age or start to dysfunction more prematurely than others, i.e. immune system or lungs? Would it be correct to tackle aging by working on systems that age in a faster way first, I think is what the question is saying.
Okay, let me take that from a biology perspective first. It's actually not completely clear that it's not really as simple as that. You know, the evolutionary understanding of aging leads us to the very clear expectation, and indeed this is confirmed, that the decline in physiological function of different systems in the body is going to happen at more or less the same age, simply because there are different genes, different genetic pathways involved. I mean, they're overlapping sets of pathways, of course, but still not identical sets of pathways involved in maintaining each system. Now, people often point to the immune system as what looks like an exception to this, but it isn't really. The reason they point to it is because we see this very overt change in the structure of the immune system in early life, relatively early life, namely the atrophy of a very important gland called the thymus. And people say, well, okay, maybe this is just driving everything because it's happening before everything else. But the thing is, the way the thymus works initially, before it atrophies, is to create a population of cells that stays with us throughout life, such that the essential disappearance of the thymus doesn't have a physiological consequence, not a big one anyway, for quite a few decades thereafter. So it's kind of from an evolutionary perspective, it's okay to let the thymus atrophy early. But the overall function of the immune system does not go downhill significantly at an earlier point in life than the rest of the body. So no, I think actually we should not be going in the direction that the questioner suggested. I think that we should be recognizing that aging is a multifaceted thing, where things obviously do have a lot of crosstalk between each other, but nevertheless, we should not run away from the idea of addressing it as a divide and conquer problem.
Makes sense. I see a question from Sean McGrath. Should this pandemic be used to push the conversation at a governmental level to promote healthy lifestyles more than has been? Almost all comorbidities that increase the severity of this disease are lifestyle related, and if mitigated, we may not ever have to have gotten in such a situation.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes.
Well, I guess then the question morphs into what's the most successful way to do that more than the efforts that are trying to push in that direction already.
It's not only that lifestyle should be promoted, but also earlier treatment of these aging-related pathologies. For example, immune deficiency or early cardiovascular aging or other components of aging should be treated early, and this disease should be used as an argument for that. The treatment should become not proactive and not reactive as it is now.
I agree. Question for David Sinclair from Michael Nutschke. I noticed preclinical research from Dr. Charles Brenner and a team from the 3 U.S. universities on possible benefits of elevating NAD levels to reduce the impact of COVID. What are your specific thoughts on this?
Well, so if you want to go to preprints.org, you can see what I've written about it. It's part of a whole review on aging-related changes in COVID, which I'm just revising for publication today. But the summary is that I think Brenner is onto something. I'll admit that when this first happened, I didn't want to be the guy that has a hammer looking for nails, and it could look self-serving if I come out and say NAD is the cure, even though, unlike some people, I'm not selling anything. I've not much to gain in terms of money at this point, but even then it would have looked bad. And I'll tell you, between friends here, even in that preprint that went up, even though NAD was maybe 5% of the entire review, the sensationalist newspapers in the UK found it, grabbed it, pulled quotes of things that I maybe said at some point, but not recently, and made a story out of it to make me look self-serving, but that's a different story. I think biologically, it's making more and more sense. Brenner has some good data that's now published. I think it's published, or at least it's up online. And we have our own data in my lab that we've got that says that NAD raising is actually good for suppressing hyperinflammation through the inflammasome. And if you go through the literature, there's lots of papers on this, so I'm not the only one who says this. But there's also anecdotes out there. There's a case report from Cedars-Sinai that says a patient recovered rapidly. Of course, doctors would say that's meaningless, but if you put everything together, including things that I'm not yet at liberty to talk about, I'm optimistic that this is certainly one thing that's worth trying, and that's why I'm working on getting a true clinical trial up and running at a few hospitals around the country. And I don't think we've got anything to lose, right? Because this is a very safe approach. I don't think there's a chance of hurting somebody. And the upside is that we could have a new arrow in our quiver, because the drugs that are out there, if you include remdesivir and chloroquine, neither of these is the cure that we were thinking they might be. So we need something else.
Right. This actually dovetails very nicely with another question that I see here from Martin O'Day, which is, I'll contextualize it a little bit more, Martin. So obviously there's been a lot of discussion about how maybe, at least in the US, we were not maybe as prepared as we could have been. So can we try to sustain a fight for so-called, as Martin says here, resistance research, resistance for upcoming pandemics, as a way since geroprotective strategies could potentially help against pandemics, and there's a focus light right on the fact that we're not as prepared as we could be, is that another avenue to say by bolstering these tracks of research, it will make us more protective against future pandemics? So specifically, like, is there a specific sort of lever that we can try to pull, like legislatively, in that regard?
And that's what I said originally when I mentioned about defensive mechanisms. Basically, improve the resilience of the receiving organism, in addition to attacking the attacker, which is the virus in this case. So definitely that's the case. So I think that's definitely what we should be focusing on. Now, I want to take a minute to also add to what David and Aubrey and others were saying about the nicotinamide and things like that. Let's not forget that those are very promising, yes, but they're not the only ones that are promising. There are others. There are clinical tests, clinical trials being done with senolytics, with rapalogs, and things like that. So there's a lot in our that we have up our sleeve. There's a lot possible approaches, and we should embrace them all and be open-minded to which one is the best, or maybe they're all equally well. We need to be open-minded about that, and there's a lot of things going on right now. We are indeed, as was mentioned, at the verge of having a breakthrough.
I agree. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So maybe Steve, I think I see a question or comment from was it Mark Sackler? Maybe you can read that one. I think it addresses one of the earlier questions that Felipe had.
I can use my best British speaking voice, which isn't very good. Where is it? Hang on. Right, Mark Sackler asks, isn't the answer that the longevity dividend can pay for solutions to the other problems of long-term future viability for the younger generations?
Yeah, that's an argument that has been made several times. Since most of the expenses of our healthcare system is spent indeed on the elderly, by having a healthier elderly, we'll be able to spend that money on other things. Hopefully not on war, but on other health issues. So basically those savings, which are likely to be substantial, could indeed be applied to things that the younger generation are also concerned about, including health, and including also, if the need is less in terms of the number of people needing these things that we currently provide for the elderly, better wheelchairs, the standard thing. Yeah, we can provide those because there will be less people needing them. But we'll also be able to get better treatment for diabetes, for all the other things that people get. So yes, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, Mark. Thanks for that. So we are, I think, wrapping up on the question section. So before we kind of go to our final part of just sort of, final thoughts, I would just sort of I like to always make bullet points at the end of any call, right? So I think what we're coming up with collectively of what can be sort of central theses of strategies that we can employ as a movement are, two of them are jumping out to me as being big ones. One of them is, I think we can focus on making a really clear and solid sort of socioeconomic case, as an extension from the Goldman paper, et cetera, that fills in a sense, some of those blank parts of the equation and has some consideration for protection against, future pandemics. And that could have, paper, writing a mathematical paper, maybe some sort of legislation that pairs with that, and a social movement that can get behind that. So I think that's a nice potential for a kind of a unified front. And also kind of dovetailing off of what Felipe was just saying, the vast benefits of how improvements in aging research could help prevent future pandemics just by creating a more robust society that then will allow us to maybe pay for other solutions. So I think those are good sort of like top level takeaways from the call. So thank you all for contributing to this discussion. But before we wrap up, I'd like to give everyone a chance, our panelists a chance to basically close with some final thoughts, plug whatever it is you want to plug, etc. So I guess, Tina, we can start with you. Muted.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I think, I, as you can probably tell, have a slightly broader view of the universe, as it were, in terms of the prevention side of things. I mean, I do see, the wider determinants of health at the root of a lot of, this whole discussion. But I think, the whole health prevention message and health prevention is so important. I mean, the NHS spends over 10% of its budget on diabetes alone, and it prioritizes resources at the end of life. And most people would rather be dying at home rather than hospitals. So there's some ridiculous the priorities are just not right. So, and that just needs to, so that hopefully the epidemic will help us address some of those, crazy things at the moment that are happening.
Hopefully. Felipe?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a fantastic discussion. I'm very glad that we have these things. I think that it's important that we, as a community of aging researchers, we put our common wisdom out there. We are the experts. Sorry, we know more than the average person. So there's a million people on Twitter and things like that giving their opinions, but we have to give ours. I think it's very important. We have to point out the importance of increasing the resilience of old people so that they can better withstand these things. And it's going to happen over and over again. There's no question about that. And the correct answer is to make them less susceptible, be less in danger. And we are the ones who have to put that out. I have to say myself, from my personal perspective, I've been very, very reluctant to do so in the past because I was a government employee. There was only so much I could say. And that changed a week ago. So we'll see. That's why I'm here.
Fantastic.
As Keith knows, I did not agree to participate in these things many, many times that he invited me because I was a government employee.
I'll admit that was a little bit of a mercenary move on my part. I saw that you were stepping down, and I was like, gonna get Felipe, gonna get him.
Yeah, the next day. Come on.
So, David, I see you were laughing at Felipe's answer, so maybe you could follow that up with, your own final thoughts.
Yeah.
David always laughs at my answer, so.
No, I thought that this has been one of the better symposia that I've been part of, because it's looking at the problem from a high level rather than everybody's little expertise in the world. And I think as a group, you brought us together because we're generalists. We are communicators as well as scientists, and I think that is very important for the field going forward. Those of us who've stuck their neck out, like Aubrey, it's very important that we do this, especially now that there's an opportunity to re-educate the world. And I hope we're in a world where our colleagues understand the importance of stepping up and educating, because in the absence of stepping up and educating, it's filled with a bunch of BS. And so we now are in this very important position where the world has turned to us, and we can use this as a platform to say what we've been saying for the last 20 or more years has never been more important. Yes, it's good to find drugs that attack the virus, but the other defensive move is to make people able to fight the virus, and that's just as important. And the drugs that are in development and the science that's going on that Felipe mentioned, not just the NAD stuff, there's hundreds of labs around the world I want to credit. This is what we've been waiting for. This is our moment to make a bigger impact than we thought we could under normal circumstances.
Absolutely. I very much second that sentiment. And, it's very hard sometimes to convince some people in the research community that, you know, you have to get out there. You have to make press appearances. You know, if you know something, we got to say something. And I think that's a nice thing that I'm seeing now, you know, David, Aubrey, especially, you know, to be able to be communicators, not just scientists, investors, et cetera. And I think as we move forward through this moment, I think it's important that we all, you know, help each other whenever we can. You know, I guess on that subject, everybody on the call here, you know, share to your social network, share this conversation. I think it's an important conversation for people to be a part of, essentially. Daria, how about your thoughts?
Okay, we should use this tragic situation also as an opportunity to improve life in the future. Possibly it's not the last pandemics and not even the last coronavirus pandemics, because we know that there were other coronavirus pandemics in the past, and we actually could calculate how much Asian economies which were affected lost. It was about 3% of GDP, which will probably now going to happen to the world. And we need to use this to educate governments and public about the importance of aging research and try to promote it as much as possible. This should be like our brightest moment, because again, even worse virus can come in the future and again affect older people.
Absolutely. I don't think we can argue with that at all. And Aubrey, I believe you're the last one. So, you know, close us out with your final thoughts.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, and thank you to all the organizers for putting this on. I think, as David said, it's been a particularly strong symposium. Well, actually, why don't I just try and close by answering a question that came up in the chat maybe 20 minutes ago. Someone asked, am I working on a new book? And I've been getting this, my book came out in 2007. I've been getting this question pretty much constantly since about 2009. You know, and I keep procrastinating and finding reasons not to do it. And eventually the situation, you know, it became so overdue that David had to do it himself. You know, but I mean, the big thing that I think is worth mentioning here is that, you know, David very kindly just mentioned that I've been out there sticking my neck out for a long time and saying things that other people, you know, have been unable or at least unwilling to say. But there's of course a reason for that, which is that I have the luxury of having an independent foundation that has been created around my work, and not therefore being beholden to the same kind of need to not piss people off that people who are more entrenched within academia have. And so I think it's really important to point out that David was able, you know, he's a Harvard professor, and he was able to write a book whose title is Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, and not get fired. You know, I mean, this, I would say, probably couldn't have happened even 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago. And so, you know, maybe we are now on the brink of a point where more of us can get out and stick our necks out than has been true in the past. And perhaps now is an opportunity to do that.
Great. I very much appreciate that sentiment. So what you're saying is that following David's lead right now, all the rest of us have to, you know, get off our tukas and write our own books. So that's more work I don't need, but we'll see how that goes. But yes, I agree with that last point, as things are changing very fast. What was once anathema 10 years ago is now quickly becoming normal, which is hopefully a good sign for our entire industry. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, our panelists, all who asked us questions, our Lifespan heroes who make all this possible at lifespan.io/hero, and everyone watching at home. Once again, if you'd like to support our work, please go to lifespan.io/support. Like and share this video, and hopefully join us at our upcoming conference at lifespan.io/conference. And since this is so nice, maybe we'll end up doing a follow-up conversation, you know, at some time in the future, when hopefully the situation will be much better than it is now. But with that, thank you all once again. Stay safe and stay healthy out there. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lifespan.io.
Thanks, Keith.